The role of intensity, or how close you train to failure, is a much talked about concept in hypertrophy training. Some camps say you need to train right to failure, while others say you need to be around 2 to 3 reps shy of failure. Regardless of the proximity to failure, some level of fatigue has to be induced. So why does fatigue matter? Before we get into that, I think failure needs to be defined, especially since there are some differences between failure in research and failure in the practical world. In the lab, you have the researchers yelling and motivating you to go to complete failure on an exercise, which usually means going until the concentric portion of the exercise can no longer be completed. In the practical setting, failure typically means you fatigued yourself to the point where you can no longer perform an exercise with good technique. The research setting doesn't entirely resemble the conditions you'd be typically experiencing while lifting, so this is something to keep in mind as we examine some of the literature. To understand the role of fatigue, we first need to understand how Henneman's size principle, or how a muscle continues to produce force in the presence of fatigue. Henneman's size principle states that motor units are orderly recruited from smallest to largest in response to increasing demand for force production or in the presence of fatigue. In repeated submax contractions, like in lifting, smaller motor units will be recruited first and will then fatigue, and then larger motor units will be progressively recruited to continue producing force. As such, a large body of the literature suggests that some level of fatigue needs to be induced to activate a large number of a muscle's motor units, resulting in mechanical tension, which then creates a stimulus for hypertrophy. A large body of literature now demonstrates that similar amounts of hypertrophy can occur with light or heavy weights as long as sets are taken to failure. This then also supports the idea that effort likely matters more than weight on the bar. A popular study from a few years ago by Barbosa and Neto et al. Looked at estimated RIR, so reps in reserve, versus the actual RIR. The subjects were 160 healthy men with at least 6 months of training experience. Subjects were then asked to use a weight on the bench press they typically perform 10 reps with. Subjects were then asked to perform as many reps as possible with that weight. And after analysis, they found only 22% of the subjects actually stayed in the 10 to 12 rep range, whereas 31% were in the 13 to 15 rep range, and 26% got 19 plus rep on that AMRAP set. Another study by Steele et al. Examined a similar concept. The subjects ranged from beginner to advanced and were given a load to use the rep to failure with, and failure here being the point where they could not perform the concentric portion of the exercise. And before the exercise, they were asked to estimate how many reps they'd get, then perform the exercise without verbal encouragement to failure. On average, subjects underestimated reps by about 3 to 4, and they also found that on average, the more experienced someone was, the better they were at predicting the repetition max. Since we now know that taking sets to fatigue is important, are people leaving gains on the table? Very interestingly, a recent study by Carroll et al. Examined taking sets to failure versus not taking sets to failure in 15 trained male subjects for 10 weeks. After the 10 weeks, they found that the group that didn't train to failure had greater gains in anatomical cross-sectional area and muscle thickness. Now, this is just one study, but it is interesting to see that within identical training programs with trained subjects, failure resulted in less gains than just taking sets to a prescribed level of effort. Another study looking at a similar concept took a look at percentage of 1RM versus RPE in a strength program which matched for sets and repetitions. The key here is that after the program was done, the authors found that significant gains were made using both methods, despite actually never training to failure. It would have been interesting to have a third group that did the exact same program but took all the sets to failure and see how that would have compared it to the other two methods. This then leads to my next point. In a lot of these failure studies, the volumes used are quite low compared to your typical hypertrophy programs. So my question is training to failure even needed if you're performing a lot of volume or multiple sets in a single session? This then leads into the topic of volume versus intensity, which is a pretty hot topic right now in the scientific community and is honestly deserving of its own video. But for the sake of this video, and to keep things brief, I think they both work more so together and are both needed for muscle growth. You need sufficient amount of sets done to some level of fatigue to induce growth. But I think with the evidence that we currently have, volume may edge out intensity. A strong piece of evidence for this was the meta-analysis by Brad Schoenfeld, Dan Ogborn, and James Krieger, who found that 10 or more sets per week generated much greater hypertrophy than 5 to 9 weekly sets, and 5 to 9 weekly sets generated more hypertrophy than less than 5 weekly sets. Therefore, they concluded that a dose-response relationship likely exists between volume and hypertrophy. There are two quick notes I want to make. And the first one is that volume is very individual. What is required to make gains, or what might be the upper limit you can recover from, will vary from person to person. I've linked a great article by Dr. Mike Isertel that discusses these volume landmarks in much greater detail. The second point I want to make is that going to either extreme of volume or intensity comes with some cost in the form of fatigue. Since the current evidence suggests that volume is likely more important, volume should probably be prioritized over failure training. So in conclusion, intensity and taking sets to a sufficient level of muscular fatigue, which will likely be close to failure, is important for hypertrophy. Volume and intensity are both required, and volume is likely a bit more important based on the evidence we have and should probably be prioritized. I think that given all of this, a good approach would be to induce some level of muscular fatigue by ensuring that you're around 1 to 3 reps shy of failure per set on average and using sufficient volume to progress. I hope you guys found this video very informative, and as always, thank you for watching.